Welcome back to Monday Musings, a casual conversation about culture and theology. I'm Justin Ely.
And I'm Daniel Chen. We're just a couple guys talking about some stuff.
The question we're going to talk about today is, what is a woman?
You know?
Yeah.
How did we get here? You know what I mean? That this is actually a valid question.
It's a sad reality, but unless you're living under a rock, you know the controversy that has erupted over the last week as Lia Thomas, formerly William Thomas, won first place in the NCAA swimming tournament, right?
Yeah, and then got so much blowback that he threw the next two races.
Right.
And if you look at the splits and stuff, it makes no sense. You can tell that Lia Thomas was purposely not going as fast as
he could.
He could, yeah.
So we're going to talk about the whole transgender discussion, debate in athletics, particularly female athletics. It's interesting you don't see the opposite of this happening. That's a part of the conversation as well.
Yeah, it's interesting. There was during the Olympics in Japan, the 2020/2021 Olympics, there was a Japanese female soccer player that came out as a man, but then said, "I'm going to wait until my soccer career is over before."
Interesting. Yep. You don't
you're
see
like,
the opposite.
You're like, wait a second.
Yep.
Let's. I'm like, are you thinking about what you're saying?
Right.
Why is that?
Right.
Why didn't you go join the men's team?
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Yep.
if you're a man.
Yep.
Why don't you go join the men's team? Or why aren't you forced to join the men's team?
Right.
And because there's a reason, and we'll talk about that today, but there's reasons of...
There are reasons it's going one way but not the other. And the good thing is, we've already said so many things that have gotten us canceled, that we're already canceled. So it's a safe space today.
It's so funny. Yeah, I think more and more, I think it's important for us to cover topics like this, because I think for Christians at least it's coming to a head of how do we respond to this?
Yep.
What do we do about this?
Yep.
Because I think a lot of people for a long time, including myself, are just sweep it under the rug.
This
see
will
if
go away.
It
has not gone away, and here we are.
Here we are.
So we're going to talk about it. But before we do, our first segment is the Restaurant of the Month.
Man, I love this segment.
It's a great segment.
Yeah, I love to eat. So my restaurant of the month is a place called JP Sushi, which is on the corner of Old Alabama and Holcomb Bridge, if you live in the area.
Nice.
And so I guess take this with a grain of salt. I'm not a huge sushi connoisseur or anything. Most of the sushi I eat, 75% of the sushi I eat is like cooked stuff. I've only recently started eating the raw fish stuff.
Bold move, Cotton.
Some people who are like, eat sushi all the time and have really strong views on this.
Right. I'm
like, give me the good sushi rice. Give me good size portions. Give me it at a reasonable rate. And, I want the fish to taste good. But JP Sushi, of all the things that I just said, large portions, reasonable price, good sushi rice, and the fish tastes good. I'm like, what more do you want? To me, it's my favorite sushi restaurant in this area.
That's awesome. That's awesome.
So, and I'll
JP
give you,
Sushi.
and the roll, they have something called the Atlanta Falcon Roll. So if you go to JP Sushi the first time, they give you this appetizer, which is this like fried red snapper with spicy mayo on top, and it's amazing. And they have a sushi roll that has that on top of the sushi roll, and I think that might be one of my favorite sushi rolls now. It's just super good.
Nice.
Yeah.
There you go, JP Sushi. My restaurant of the month, I'm zooming out of Atlanta here. I'm going all the way to Augusta, where my wife is from. And since the Masters tournament is coming up, I'm wearing my Masters shirt this morning. So for those of you making your annual pilgrimage down to the Holy Land of Augusta, Frog Hollow, amazing restaurant in Augusta, really nice, pretty upscale, and get the pork chop.
Nice.
I'm not a big pork chop guy, but this was like a steak almost. I mean, I've never had a pork chop taste like this or cooked like this. It was the most amazing pork chop I've ever had in my life, times 10.
Yeah, I feel like pork is either like okay or really good. And if you find a really good pork dish or pork chop, it's worth getting.
Yeah. So Frog Hollow, pork chop, do it. Restaurant of the month. Okay, so let's talk about what is a woman. The recent, victory of Lia Thomas, formerly William Thomas, in the swim tournament has just ignited so much controversy. And it comes down to, like, our society can't definitively say what a woman is anymore. J.K. Rowling, author of the Harry Potter series, has almost become, she was a darling of the left years ago.
Right.
And people were so happy when she said Dumbledore was gay. And then now she's become, like, she almost sounds like conservative, like, because she's fighting for women being women and not having biological men take over.
She, for years, was a champion of feminism.
Yeah.
And today she still is.
She would say, I stayed consistent. I'm championing women.
Yeah. And it's almost like, is it Bill Maher?
Bill Maher, the same thing.
Who said, I
haven't changed.
Yes.
Everyone else has.
Everyone has gone so far left of him that he was very left, considered very left like 30 years ago, 20 years ago.
Yep.
And now he's like almost right. In terms
weird.
of conservatism.
He like sounds, yeah.
And really he's like, I haven't changed at all. I'm still, liberal or however you can, but liberalism has gone so far left.
Yep.
That he seems conservative in comparison, and J.K. Rowling as well.
Yep.
And I think they call her a TERF. I don't really know what that stands for. So I don't think it's a bad word, right?
I think it's like a considered demeaning. I don't know. Yeah.
I guess it's like the LGBT community calls people that are like
trans exclusionary radical feminist.
Okay.
Is what it stands for. Yep.
Which I'm like, wow, we're like so far in the weeds here that's even a thing.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right. So we want to kind of zoom out, take this swim meet, and zoom out on the larger question of gender identity, transgenderism,
right,
biological men competing in women's sports. What is a woman? What is a man? We want to go zoom to the image of God as a biblical doctrine, right? Genesis 1:27, God created man in his image, male and female he created them. So what does it mean to be made in the image of God related to this topic on transgenderism and men competing in women's sports? I think we need to do two things. We need to honor the image of God in all people, including trans persons. And then we need to honor the differences that the image of God shows us. So we want to kind of talk about each of those two things. So first, in this topic, especially Christians, as we engage in social media, as we repost articles, as we talk to individuals, we need to honor the image of God in trans persons. And what I mean by that is individuals who are transgender, biological men identifying as women or biological women identifying as men, are created in the image of God, and they don't need to be treated as subhuman.
Right.
And, I mean, we're both of us have daughters. I'm very concerned about biological men trying to sneak into my daughter's locker room. But, so that concern is valid, and I'm going to be strong on that. But I also don't want to treat those people as somehow subhuman.
Right. And just to give a little background with Lia Thomas still has all the male anatomy.
Right.
And so, but Lia Thomas changes in the locker room with all the other women.
Right.
With a penis.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, think about that.
Yep.
Swims in a one piece that you would think of.
Right.
One piece that a woman wears.
Yep.
With a penis.
Yep.
So there's a lot of issues with Lia Thomas, in my opinion, swimming in the NCAA championship. Mm-hmm. But that might be the biggest one.
Right.
Where, like you said, you don't want your daughter to be in a locker room. Yep. With a man with a penis.
Right.
That's claiming to be a woman.
Yep.
And it's funny, 10 years ago, people were laughing at people who said that would happen, and here we are.
Right.
But to your point, there's a way to stand up for what we believe is true without taking away their humanity.
Right.
And I would say even the more likely case is probably not necessarily the dehumanization of someone, but just the complete, I don't know, meanness of and almost hatred of that person.
Right.
Right?
I mean, this, like, ironically, like, Lia Thomas has parents. I was going to say Lia Thomas is someone's son, but now she's trying to be daughter. But there are people who love this individual, who were raised with this individual, and we just have to remember we're talking about a fellow human being here. And so yes, I am strongly opposed to what's going on, and I have serious theological and practical issues of great concern. But let's just not forget there's a person on the other side of that critique.
Yeah.
And so how we talk about them, how we talk to them is just so important, that there is an honoring of the image of God. Ironically, trans individuals are attempting to distort the image of God in their lives.
Yeah.
But they can't fully do it.
No.
You're made in the image of God, whether you like it or not.
Yeah.
And we need to treat people that way.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. We're going to get to the differences in gender too, but there is part of being made in the image of God is how God has made us, physically and biologically. But part of it is the essence of who we are as human beings as well. And you can't necessarily, you can't take that away. You can't cut that out of you, right?
Right.
But I'll just say, for example, of what does it look like to honor the image of trans persons, people?
I don't know.
I
always get confused on the person's people thing.
Yeah, well, I'm not the grammar guy, so I'm the wrong person to talk to. But there's a pastor in our area that posted something on his Facebook about this, saying, I have 3 daughters. This is very concerning to me, right? Because once again, William Thomas was ranked like 400 something in men's swimming in the nation, and Lia Thomas is ranked 1.
Right.
I mean, think about that.
Hello.
You want to tell me that there's no differences or whatever? Of course there is.
Yep.
If you look at the picture, I mean, he's massive. He's tall and built. I mean, just think of Michael Phelps. When you see Michael Phelps, he's big. He's tall. He's long.
Someone has posted or many people posted the picture of the award ceremony.
Right.
And you got, first, second, third place. And many have said this picture alone should end the debate on this. I mean, it is cringeworthy.
Yes.
The clear biological, physical differences.
Right.
I mean, it makes you cringe, honestly.
Yeah, just to see it. And so he was speaking out. He's a pastor in there. He's speaking out against that, speaking for truth, saying this is crazy. He has $3. Like, it's both unfair and, once again, as we talk about the locker room stuff, like dangerous for our daughters.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And there's like tons of comments under his Facebook posts, and some of them are just agreeing with him. Some of them are mean comments. And he posted again saying, hey, look, I'm posting this to stand up for truth, to oppose a system that allows this to happen.
Mm-hmm.
But he said, but especially as Christians, please don't demean Lia Thomas. And I thought that was a really well-handled way to do it, where he's both upholding this truth without being hateful.
Yep.
And it's funny because, people on the left will still call him a bigot or whatever.
Sure.
Just because he doesn't.
Yeah, you don't fit the party line.
You don't fit the party line, but he's not a bigot. That's crazy to think that, right? Yep. And same with us. I'm sitting here thinking, if the wrong person hears this podcast, they're going to call us a bigot because we're using he pronouns.
Yep.
But I'm sitting here thinking, saying, no, we're trying to argue for upholding the Imago Dei, like we've talked about so much in this podcast in this past year. And so I'm sitting here like, if you want to call me bigot, that's fine. I know I'm not one.
Yep.
You know what I mean? I'm trying to say, no, we don't need to be hateful towards Lia Thomas.
Right.
But we can also say this is not okay.
Yes.
So
We did a podcast years ago, back in season 1, I believe. I think it was called like Keyboard Crusaders or something.
Yep.
And we talked about what's your term that you use? Abstraction?
Yes.
We do this a lot, right, on social media, is we suffer from abstraction because there's not a person sitting right in front of us, so we just type these things that you would never say to a person face to face.
Right.
And so I think we need to keep that in mind in our kind of language and dialogue on all this. So that's the first thing to think about, honoring the image of God in the trans person that we are referring to, talking about, discussing. But secondly, is honoring the image of God in the differences. He has made us male and female. We are not the same. We are equal in worth, but very different in how we were made, and even to a degree why we were made, the function that we take in the home, in the church, for example.
Yeah, I mean, I don't understand. Don't these people who are pushing this transgender stuff know women are from Venus?
And men are from Mars.
And men are from
Mars. I mean, it's straight in the second opinions, I think, of the Bible.
Yeah, that's just straight up science, isn't that?
I mean,
we
I think my mom had that book like in our living room when I was growing up. I don't think she ever read it though, but I think it was
Is
there.
that a book? I thought it was just people kids say.
It's a book,
that's
I think.
funny.
Yeah.
I thought that's. I remember in elementary school people would just like say that.
Yeah. So there's a great book which I would highly recommend called "Designed for Joy: How the Gospel Impacts Men and Women, Identity and Practice." Great book. We have our discipleship groups go through it. And in one of the chapters, it's called Being a Man and Acting Like a Man. And he talks about what does it mean to be a man? Like, how do you define it? And you could give the flip definition of this for a woman as well.
Sure.
So this is Jonathan Parnell. He said, being a male is to naturally have male parts, male traits, and a male sense. So he says there are kind of three perspectives: the biological perspective, male parts; the sociological perspective, male traits, that there's a societal witness to our masculinity or femininity; and finally, a psychological perspective, a male sense, how I perceive myself to be. And so you could say the same thing about what does it mean to be a woman: female parts, female traits, female sense. I think this is a really helpful definition because it gives you kind of a three-pronged approach to, like, being a man is more than just having male anatomy.
Right.
But it's not less. Being a woman is more than having female anatomy, but not less.
Right.
So how do these three parts help you as you kind of think through this definition?
Yeah, so it's funny. So this question, what is a woman, is posed by a commentator called Matt Walsh, which some people love him, some people hate him. We're neutral here on this podcast towards him, I think. But he always asks, as he debates, people, this question, what is a woman? And because he says it's the simplest question, but no one who debates him can actually give him an answer.
Right.
And so I think what this is helpful is it gives us as Christians an answer to that question.
Right.
Why do we keep using he pronouns from Lia Thomas? It's because according to our definition of what a man is and what a woman is,
he is a man.
Right. It will determine how we view that person and the use of pronouns, right? The reason that the pronouns is even thing is because in this postmodern culture where there's no truth or whatever, everything can shift all the time, right?
Yep.
And so the parts, traits, and sense, it's just a really helpful paradigm, right?
Yep.
So it starts biologically how we're born.
Right.
And it's funny. I'll say this with the parts thing too. There's been some people say it's a scientific fact that there's more than just men and women, because there's some who are hermaphrodites who have both parts.
Right.
And I think there's another side of that, like, however you want to see it, you know. But it's funny. Those are anomalies,
Right.
right? Those are outliers.
Right. We're not denying that's a thing,
Yeah,
but it is an anomaly. Yep.
Yeah, it's like a genetic anomaly for that to happen.
Yep.
And you never ever say what is true from your data from your outliers. You
Right.
don't never define anything from your outliers.
Right.
Right.
That's why they're called outliers.
Right. And so for that argument to happen is
Right.
kind of crazy to me. But yeah, so there are female parts biologically and
Yep.
male parts.
Right.
Right. And that's where we start.
Right.
That's an objective thing that happens.
Right. And then we go to sociological perspective, our traits. And this book, Jonathan Parnell, he quotes Paul's discussion in 1 Corinthians 11, which we recently went through as a church, that at its most fundamental level says in every society, we by nature know that men act a certain way and women act a certain way.
Yeah.
And we talked about this even in church. To a certain degree, some of that is culturally conditioned, different from culture to culture. In America, men, you should not wear skirts.
Right.
In Scotland, men, you can wear kilts.
Yeah.
So there is a little bit of a difference, but there is a sense in which there is a certain way to act like a man, and there's a certain way to act like a woman. There's a certain way to dress like a man. There's a certain way to dress like a woman. Some of that, I would argue, is cross-cultural, cross-time, and some of that is cultural specific.
Absolutely.
And this is where, so you start on the biological sense, very black and white. This is where it starts to get into a little bit of gray to a certain degree.
Right.
And this is where the gender confusion is coming into play, because you're having people that are adapting traits of the opposite gender.
Right.
And that becomes problematic. But there's and then the other thing we have to consider in a society like ours that has been so inundated with kind of the trans revolution, society begins to lose those distinctions between men and women. But they're still there, but society has tried to push them away, but it hasn't worked.
Right.
You know what a man should be, you know what a woman should be.
Yeah.
So that's the sociological perspective trace. And then the psychological perspective, this understanding within yourself of what I am. And what's interesting about kind of the trans revolution is you take the most subjective piece, is your feelings about yourself, and then you try to alter the most objective part, your biological reality, to fit your feelings of the moment.
Right.
And Jonathan Parnell puts it, he said, ironically, the goal of becoming transgender is to have all three perspectives saying the same thing, even if by inauthentic and superficial means. So you're trying to alter your traits or alter your parts to fit your sense. But that's an inauthentic definition of masculinity or femininity, manhood or womanhood.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting because, parts, traits, sense. You start with parts, which is objective. That's what you're born with.
It is what it is.
Right? And you move more towards subjective, right?
Right.
Going to the traits. Which is some
Yeah,
black,
in
some gray,
between, yep.
And then you have sense, which is just completely subjective,
Right.
Of how you view yourself. But it makes sense as we follow this trajectory of, as we enter more and more into a postmodern world. Where
What is truth?
Because you have thrown out objective truth in that worldview, everything is subjective.
The reason we're asking the question, what is a woman, is because years and years ago we asked, what is truth?
Right. Isn't that interesting?
That's the natural byproduct.
And so if we tell people you need to start with the subjective,
right, which is postmodernism.
then the objective things that you see that don't match your subjective, it's not. So it used to be 1 + 1 = 2. And if I said it's 3, I need to correct my 3 to a 2.
Right.
Now,
It's
in
like,
a postmodern world,
if you want it to be 3.
if you want it to be 3, you just change the equation.
Yep. Well,
Right?
I just wish you'd stop being racist doing math. But that's another podcast.
Man, see, that's another.
It's actually an example. I'm being tongue in cheek, but it's an example of this effective
Right.
postmodernism.
Well, and I was just gonna say too, Like, you can't tell an Asian guy to stop doing math. You know what I mean?
Whoa,
like, is
whoa,
that the
whoa,
hey,
whoa,
whoa,
whoa.
you know? Is that
Sorry,
allowed?
sorry. Yeah, getting kind of testy here. Okay. Let's just get off the tough topics of race and get back to the easy topics of gender.
Right.
You know?
But it is interesting to see, right? Where instead
Yes.
of changing your answer to, we were given an equation. Instead of getting the right answer, we've just decided what our answer wants to be, and we're just trying to change the equation now.
Yeah.
Which is, I just think no one thinks about that.
Right. I'm teaching my daughters. I'm starting with parts, moving to traits, moving to sense.
Sure.
You are a woman.
Right.
You have female parts. This is what it means. This is what they're called.
Right.
Because of that, there's a certain way for you to dress, behave, present yourself, traits.
Right.
There's a certain way as a girl that you behave in society, look in society.
Right.
Finally, sense. So you need to think of yourself. You need to align your feelings with your reality, right? So parts, traits, sense, you start with the objective, move greater to the subjective to have kind of a full definition of manhood or womanhood. You're right. I mean, our postmodern culture does the total opposite. And we start with the subjective and move to the objective, which becomes a really big problem, because if you start with the subjective and then you use surgery to change your objective,
Right.
how do you know your subjective feeling won't change in
Again.
5 or 10 years?
Well, it's interesting. There's actually a fairly big movement, and there's like Trans Awareness Day or something that happened like a week or two ago, and it's
wow.
all of these people who have told their stories of, in high school, a lot of the stories kind of follow the same trend. I hated myself.
Yep.
And so I wanted to change myself. And the school counselor told me that I was really a man, and they took testosterone and they reverted back because they realized their issue was psychological.
Right.
Right. But it's interesting because, if you get a certain surgery, if you're a man trying to transition
You're
to be
done.
a woman,
You can never undo that.
Yeah.
And I think the very tragic thing is, and we've known this what's the most awkward time of your life? Middle school. Easy. It doesn't matter how good your school is. It's just an awkward time. Everyone's going through changes. You're trying to figure out who you are. It's a very confusing time.
Yeah.
The tragedy of what we have done to our children is we have taken a time that's already hard enough. It's already hard enough to be a teenager. It's already hard enough to be in middle school. And we dumped this burden on them that you're never supposed to bear. You're never supposed to bear the burden of trying to figure out if you should be a man or a woman. That's not a burden anyone should ever carry. You are what you are. But we've added this burden to people that are already in a very difficult, malleable, confused time in life.
Yeah.
And I think it's a very unkind, torturous thing we have done to our children that is just cruel and unusual punishment.
Yeah.
Not that we should, of course, we should have compassion toward children that are dealing with gender identity confusion and guys that don't feel like they're like that last part, that sense. They don't feel that.
Right.
Of course we should have compassion toward that. Women that don't feel that they're a woman. Of course we should have compassion toward that. But compassion is not allowing people to embrace a lie about themselves. But that's what society has said is the compassionate thing to do is to allow people to embrace a lie. And that's a very unkind thing to do. And I think we're seeing that come to fruition.
Yeah, I agree. And I think something that's interesting to even note here is you have, I think what people don't realize is that people just assume I'm always born this way, right?
Right.
And so they just run with that, and that's like the only objective thing that they believe, right? Not understanding that a lot of this is stuff that's happening in your mind.
Right.
And so
instead of saying I was born this way with male parts,
right,
you say I feel this, so I was born this way.
With this
feeling.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then you let yourself plus your society define who you are.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's interesting that if you've looked at some of the statistics that have come out, every generation in the past, 100 years or whatever, identify it's something like 5 to 10% LGBT.
Okay.
And Gen Z is like 39%.
Wow.
So, what does that tell you?
Yeah.
All of a sudden,
an
like
eightfold increase.
all of a sudden, if it's like genetic, like everyone's genetics changed
Right.
in one generation.
Right.
No, I think, I guess you could say that, it's now acceptable now. So I'm like, but you think in history, 40% of our population was.
Right. No way.
No, yeah, this is, statistically, it's nonsense statistically,
Right.
right? And I think that the explanation that people don't understand is our society is trying to take subjective and make it objective and throw out the objective.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what we're saying is, no, there's objective realities here that need to define our subjective, realities or whatever in the right mind.
Yeah. It is interesting that the group in society that is most likely to like affirm Darwinianism and evolution is also the most likely to affirm like transgenderism.
Right.
And it's like, wow, you're really holding two things together that actually can't go together.
They're incompatible.
So yeah, it's interesting to see kind of the cultural mix-up of worldviews, competing worldviews that actually don't fit together, that are being force-fit together.
Right.
So,
well, even to that, just kind of like a step forward, like with the Lia Thomas stuff, where are the feminists?
Right.
Besides J.K. Rowling.
Besides J.K. Rowling, that have for decades and decades said, I am woman, hear me roar. Yeah.
And now there's like almost a split even between the feminists, because there are some that are aligned with, J.K. Rowling's view of feminism.
Right.
And there are some who have just caved.
Yep. And we mentioned this earlier, the very beginning of the podcast, right? There is a reason that the controversy is biological men identifying as women and then competing in women's sports,
right?
Not the other way around. And that has to do with the male parts sense. Bone structure, testosterone through puberty, the way men are built is giving them a competitive advantage over women.
Right.
So you don't hear trans men. I get the terms confused, honestly. Biological women who are identifying as men.
Right.
They're not going to compete in the men's sports because you have a total disadvantage.
Right.
In these kind of things. What's interesting is even Caitlyn Jenner, formerly Bruce Jenner,
right,
he has gone off on this in saying, I'm invited to women's golf tournaments all the time, and I always say no because I know it's not fair. I have a competitive advantage. My shoulder width, how my body is built.
Yeah.
I can still hit a golf ball like a man, and it gives me a competitive advantage against these women, even though I've been taking estrogen for years.
Right.
So he at least still gets it.
Right.
Which is just ironic.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think it's an interesting conversation because we were reading this David French article, kind of. He was kind of saying, well, what is equality then?
Right.
What is equality for, people who are transgendered? And so, do you want to just give a quick summary of that?
Yeah, let's see if I can actually find what he said. So this was David French's article, What Do We Do When People Are Equal But Not Alike? Lia Thomas and a Proper Understanding of American Equality. We'll post it in the show notes, but I'll just read. You want me to read this a little bit?
Yeah, just read that snippet. I just thought it was like...
This is kind of midway through his article. He said, now let's bring these principles back to our present controversy. Let's imagine a trans employee named Gina. At work, Gina is remarkably effective, better than many peers. Gina's employee evaluations are sterling. Customers love interacting with Gina. Then one day, a new manager discovers that Gina was once called George. Driven by animosity or disagreement, he first sidelines, then fires one of his best employees. This action should offend our moral commitment to equality. In every way that mattered, job performance, customer interactions, kindness to colleagues, Gina was similar to peer employees. The job wasn't supposed to belong to a competent adult woman or a man, but rather to a competent adult person. And when that competent adult person is fired for reasons that have nothing to do with job performance and everything to do with gender identity, then similarly situated people have not been treated alike. But let's put Gina in a different context, a competitive women's swim meet. Is Gina or another trans woman similarly situated to female competitors? No. The female swimmers did not go through male puberty. They do not have male bone structure. In fact, under traditional equal protection categories, treating a competitive women's swim meet as both a male and a female space could violate the principle of treating similarly situated people alike and result in exploiting or harming the vulnerable class. It's true that certain interventions, such as suppressing testosterone, can ameliorate the differences between trans women and women. Lia Thomas is not the fastest swimmer ever to compete in women's freestyle and even finished 5th in the 200-meter freestyle. But they cannot eliminate it entirely. In the aggregate, differences will remain and they can be profound. Performing in women's meets substantially improved Thomas's overall results. Moreover, athletics are not the only location where trans women and women are not similarly situated. Consider locker rooms, for example. If a man walked in and revealed his genitalia, that would be indecent exposure. If a trans woman exposes a penis, is that somehow different? Is a woman bigoted if she doesn't want to see biologically male genitalia, even if that genitalia belongs to a trans woman? And yes, these problems can be ameliorated by prudent privacy measures. They should be ameliorated, but calling attention to them isn't bigotry. It's not hate. It's entirely consistent with treating women fairly. That's a really profound section of his article.
Yeah. I think it just gives. It's easy to just view this as like high level stuff, but I think that's like a very practical, like where we draw some lines, you know, and even in terms of like the Imago Dei, right? It's like,
and he was helpful about saying there is a difference between just any kind of job in this, right, versus a swim meet. Like, we should be able to make distinctions here.
Yeah.
So, you know, I think a lot of Christians say, I just don't want to get involved in the culture wars.
Right.
Why should Christians be standing for the truth here?
You know, I think I was one of those Christians for a long time.
Hey, I just don't want to.
Yeah, just sweep it on the rug.
Yeah.
I'm like non-confrontational. I'm like, don't want to, you know, have confrontation if I don't need to, right? I don't want to poke the bear, you know?
Right.
But I just think more and more, I just see how this kind of stuff will affect my children.
Yep.
And our society, right? And I think, especially for my children, and especially for my daughter, I just think about if my daughter was one of those swimmers, what I would do.
Oh my gosh!
And I'm like, I'd probably be all over the news.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right.
But also now it's starting to leak over, not just into the locker room, but what our kids are being taught in schools. I've not heard of anything in our area yet, but in places like California, Virginia, Oregon, these places, I mean, I've even heard stories in Texas, different parts of Texas, which you would think is really conservative, that you have, you know, trans, like you had a man or a woman say they were a man, I forgot which way it went, to a bunch of like fourth graders.
Yep.
Or third graders or something. And I'm like, that's the thing. Like, why are we talking about this gender identity stuff to our children who, once again, like you said, middle schoolers are confused, but like 7-year-olds like have no concept of any of this.
Right.
And you're just, and it's funny because even Florida's, you know, quote unquote, what they call the Don't Say Gay bill.
Right. Which isn't in the bill. Yep.
Which isn't in the bill is really just to protect
5-year-olds
from
having sex ed in their classroom.
Yes.
Yeah. Why that is controversial is beyond me.
Yeah, it's crazy, right? But also, it's starting to come, and we'll do a podcast later on this. movies,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and Disney movies. And for example, like the first like LGBT kisses coming up in
Right.
the new Buzz Lightyear movie.
Yep.
But the thing that people don't talk about is, it's funny. Christians always, I feel like, get this like pushback about how we indoctrinate our kids.
Yeah, but like, don't talk about indoctrination. Yeah.
But here's the thing: Christians need to indoctrinate your kids because something is.
Something is absolutely.
You don't think Disney
Right.
is indoctrinating your kids?
Yep.
You don't think the teachers are indoctrinating
Right.
your kids? You
Right.
don't think TV shows and media and stuff you see on your phone is indoctrinating not just our kids but us as well? No, of course it is. And I think that's why it's important, because ultimately it's important because we hold to a standard of truth we see from God through the scriptures.
Mm-hmm.
And I think more and more, and I think if you follow those doctrines, and I know there's been a lot of abuse in the name of
Sure.
Christ, but you build a fruitful society that leads to godliness and the flourishing of humans.
Yep. And I think flourishing is the key word, right? So when I first got a car, my dad taught me the importance of changing my oil.
Right.
He didn't teach me how to change my oil. He taught me how to go to the car shop and pay someone else to change my oil. But he said, if you don't do this, you will ruin your car.
Yeah.
You will destroy your engine. That was not my dad being bigoted. That was my dad saying, I need you to understand how a car works.
Yeah.
Because if you don't understand how a car works, bad things are going to happen.
Right.
We are designed by God, and following his instruction manual isn't cruel. It's not bigoted. It's for our flourishing. So
Right.
the reason we should care is we want people to flourish.
Right.
And you're not going to flourish apart from God's design. And so society is best ordered when we take God's commands and design seriously to lead to the flourishing of humankind.
Yeah.
So that's why it matters.
Yeah, I think it happens on two levels. Specifically for my kids, I'm very concerned.
Yeah.
Because I don't want them to be taught lies about themselves or
Right.
about their friends or about how they view the world. And I care about it on a macro level for our society too. I think if you see the downfalls of any empire in history, it all starts with the destruction of the nuclear family. And I really think, and I don't mean this in a mean way, but all the agenda of the LGBTQ is the destruction, is like tearing
The destruction
down
of the nuclear family.
family.
Yep.
And I think what you will see is if this continues on, you will see society more and more start to crumble and crumble and crumble in life as we know it. And I actually think, my friend asked me, in 30 years, what do you think our society will look back in and say, wow, we really missed the mark on this one? And my answer was this one.
Yeah, it is, and this is where some good cultural analysis helps. You take the LGBTQ movement, you take the BLM movement, and a lot of these things actually tie back to critical theory.
It does.
And we did a podcast on critical race theory, but critical race theory is a subset of critical theory.
Right.
And critical theory essentially teaches that all authority structures are oppressive.
Right.
And you need to tear them all down.
Right.
Not reform them.
Right.
Rip them down. And society can only be, freed from oppression when the people at the top who are somehow automatically oppressors are ripped from their positions of power.
Right.
And that's what you see in this movement, right?
Right.
It's not a reform movement. It's a ripping down of the structures of society movement.
Right. And I think ironically, they don't realize that eventually, if they do succeed, they become the authority that needs to be torn down.
Yeah, it's a never-ending cycle of destruction. Yeah. So how should Christians respond?
I think it kind of starts with, we'll start on a personal micro level. I would say speak the truth.
Yep.
Don't be afraid to speak the truth. I think for a long time, I was afraid of being called a bigot.
Yeah.
And you know what? we're doing this podcast because I think it's important. This has gotten to a point where it's important enough to me where
we talk about
I
it.
think this is true. I'm like, this is where I am.
Yep.
And I will stand for what I think is true.
Yep.
And on the other side, like we said, do it with respect and love and care.
Yeah. Don't
And so-
dehumanize trans persons. Yeah.
And if someone says you hate me because you don't agree with me, I would say I don't hate you, but I can't convince you I don't hate you.
Yep.
But I don't. I really don't. Actually, I'm only saying something because I do care.
Right.
If I didn't care, I would just be indifferent and
Just whatever.
and just whatever. But I do care about me, my kids, you.
Yeah.
Like whoever I'm talking to, I care about our society, and that's why I say it's saying something. And so I think partially is speaking the truth. I would say even maybe the first step, maybe even for Christians, having conversations with people who believe what we've talked about and disagree with you.
Sure.
And speak to them in truth and love.
Yeah.
I also think there's an element. Did you want to add anything to that?
No, I thought it was good. Yeah.
Is being involved in our communities. I think something that I've
Yep.
seen that's interesting is like all this stuff with like the school boards in California and all this stuff. I'm like, why are they all the same? Why did everyone on the school board believe the same thing about these things?
Yep.
And I'm like, you know what? If I believe this, I started looking up like, how do I join a school board?
Yep.
And maybe it's not that, but I plan to join like the PTA next year. I think if you want to have a hand in what your children is learning, is one, like, don't just send your kids off to school and then come back and then live your lives.
Yep.
Be involved. Be involved in their lives.
Absolutely.
Ask them good questions. What did you learn? What did your teachers say? But also be on the other side where you're in the schools, you're meeting the teachers, the principal, and you're involved in your community, not just the schools, but in your community at large.
Well, I think this was actually a unexpected benefit of COVID is all these parents had to be actively involved in their kids' education.
Yeah.
And that led to, you're learning what?
Right.
And that led to a lot of parents getting really ticked off about what their kids were learning or were not learning, and led to kind of a parent revolt a little bit. I mean, we saw it very clearly in Virginia, but I think that's nationwide. And that's a good thing. Parents should be involved in the education of your kids. If you're not going to homeschool and you're going to send them off to either private school or public school, be involved. And then be involved in their sports teams, know their coaches, play a role in that.
Right.
I think, if anything, this needs to bring an end to the passive parent who just exports their kids off to school or other activities.
Yeah.
And that was never good to begin with, but we especially know now it's not good.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'd say as you're doing this, and this goes back to the kind of the first point of the speak the truth and don't dehumanize, is we just don't need to be like throwing grenades.
Right, it just doesn't help. It might
just
make might make you feel better, but it doesn't help.
And so I think what we would say is like stand up for the truth, but we can do it in a way where we're not like starting a war. Like we talk about culture wars, but it's like
in the Christian community right now, for some reason, like being a jerk is like a prize of honor.
Right.
And I'm like, no, you're just a jerk. It's almost like we want to show that we care about the truth.
Right.
And so we just think of like the most abrasive way to say things.
Right.
And I'm like, okay, well, and that convinced who? Like,
right.
it made you look tough. Like, and what did that accomplish?
Right.
Yeah. So it's just not the space for making yourself look tough.
Yeah. And I think, how do we, impact our society? Ultimately, it's by doing what God has commanded us, which is to be fruitful, multiply, and disciple your kids. On average, we might be close to or under the reproduction rate.
Yeah.
And so, but honestly, where does the LGBT way of thinking lead to? It's not more kids.
Yes, I mean, follow the science here.
Right? And so I'm like, if you want to quote unquote win the culture war, have kids.
Yep. And
disciple them.
I posted an article Kevin DeYoung wrote about that years ago, and oh man, did I get some blowback on that one. I was like, I just thought it was an interesting article, and it was like people I went to high school with, like out of the woods that I haven't talked to. They're like, I can't believe you. But I mean, hey, there's something to, like, if you're Christian, you're
Yeah.
married, have some babies, teach them to love Jesus. And and I think, last thing, this is the intersection of politics and faith here. Who you vote for matters.
And not just the president, but
All the way
absolutely.
down to your local city council,
Yeah.
local school board. I think in some ways we are, you reap what you sow.
Right.
And there's been a lot of sowing for a number of years that a fair number of Christians have just dismissed as like, oh, this will go away, or this isn't that big of a deal.
Right.
And I think we're finding out it is and was a big deal, and your vote does matter.
Yeah.
And of course, you don't vote on one issue. There's a variety of issues you have to vote for.
Right.
But, I mean, can I just suggest that it should be kind of someone you vote against if they want men to be able to enter women's locker rooms? I think that should be like a X mark.
Yeah.
And I think for the longest time, the people that have excused it of like, oh, that's not going to happen or whatever.
Right.
Here we are. We're here.
We're here.
It's happening. And we just shouldn't. We should stand for women, and we should care about women.
Yeah.
And this is not caring for women.
Yeah. And we should stand for men.
Right.
Because those, too.
Right.
But yeah, I think it's funny. I think you mentioned like somehow like the Republican Party right now is like the champion of
women.
And like 30
like,
years ago,
man,
you'd
this
be like,
changed. Yeah.
you're like, what? And once again, like, we don't want to get too political right now in this particular podcast, but just think about who you're like. I think I'll say this with saying, I hate that we have a two-party system.
Yep.
Because people just assume if you
Yep.
disagree with this side, you must be the other side.
It-
and I'm like, that's crazy.
Right.
It's just, but I think asking the question, no one is perfect.
Yep.
Right. And there are a lot of bad people on both sides in both parties. But I do believe you should ask the question as a whole, is our society moving towards,
Right.
What God envisions as,
Yep.
his kingdom and how the world should be or not?
Yep.
And I think there are some really glaring issues that we need to consider, and
Yep.
this being one of them.
Yeah. A lot to think about, but we'd love to hear your thoughts. You're welcome to email us, info@christfellowshipga.org. Love to hear how you're processing and thinking through this topic, but it's a lot to think through. But here we are.
Here we are.
Thanks for joining us for Monday Musings this week. We'll talk to you again next week.